Think Zimbabwe is only known for economic collapse and political turmoil? You won't believe what I'm about to reveal. Wait until you find out about trillion-dollar bills that couldn't buy a loaf of bread, a country where Supreme Courts legally declared women inferior to men, and marriage traditions that make Western weddings look like budget garage sales. Number 15. Zimbabwe printed $100 trillion bills that couldn't buy a single bus ticket. You heard right? Zimbabwe issued the largest denomination currency note in human history, worth 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars, and it was literally worthless the moment it was printed. During the height of hyperinflation in 2008, prices were rising by 7.6 billion% per month, making these astronomical denominations completely useless for actual purchases. Picture this, you'd walk into a grocery store with a suitcase full of trillion-dollar bills and still not have enough money to buy a loaf of bread, which cost over 300 billion Zimbabwean dollars. The irony is mind-blowing. These worthless trillion-dollar notes now sell for $300 to $500 each to international collectors, making them worth more as novelty items than they ever were as actual currency. Zimbabweans would literally need wheelbarrows full of cash to buy basic groceries, and many people stopped counting money altogether, instead weighing it by the kilogram. Bank machines couldn't function because they couldn't dispense enough physical notes to represent any meaningful value. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine working your entire life savings becoming worthless overnight, not once, but repeatedly, as the government kept removing zeros from the currency. Number 14. Zimbabwe operates under a dual legal system where traditional chiefs can legally override government courts and issue punishments that modern law doesn't recognize. The country functions with both Roman Dutch law and traditional customary law, creating parallel justice systems that sometimes contradict each other completely. Traditional chiefs wield genuine legal authority over marriage disputes, inheritance cases, and even criminal matters, with their decisions carrying the same weight as government court rulings. Here's where it gets crazy. A government court might rule one way on a property dispute, but if the traditional chief issues a different judgment, locals will often follow the chief's decision instead of the official legal ruling. These traditional courts operate with completely different procedures. No lawyers, no written records, just oral testimony and decisions based on centuries-old customs that can seem bizarre to outside observers. The punishments can be extreme: public humiliation, banishment from communities, or compensation demands that exceed anything a modern court would impose. Think Western legal systems are slow? Traditional chiefs can resolve complex disputes in single afternoons that would take government courts months or years to handle. The system creates fascinating conflicts. Educated Zimbabweans who live in cities still return to traditional courts for family matters because they view them as more legitimate than Western-style legal proceedings. In Zimbabwe, brides require lobola payments that can exceed $15,000, often bankrupting grooms' families and creating marriage negotiations that last for years. Lobola isn't just a dowry, it's actually a complex financial transaction that determines social status, family alliances, and economic relationships for generations. The bride price negotiations involve extensive family meetings where every aspect of the bride's education, beauty, family background, and potential earning capacity is evaluated and assigned monetary value. Wait until you find out how detailed these calculations get. A university degree adds $3,000 to $5,000 to the lobola price, while traditional cooking skills, family reputation, and even the bride's mother's behavior influence the final amount. Families often spend months or even years negotiating, with discussions that can break down over disagreements of a few $100s, leading to postponed or canceled weddings. The pressure on young men is crushing. Many delay marriage for years while saving money, working multiple jobs, or borrowing from extended family networks just to afford lobola payments. Here's the twisted part. Families sometimes mortgage their land or sell livestock to pay lobola, then expect the new daughter-in-law to work without compensation to help recover the investment. Modern educated women face a cruel paradox. Their education increases their lobola value, but they're often forbidden from working after marriage, making their expensive education essentially useless while their families profit from their academic achievements. Zimbabwe has marriage customs where new wives must undergo ritual testing by mother-in-laws, including cooking competitions and fertility examinations, that determine their acceptance into families. These aren't friendly family bonding activities. We're talking about systematic evaluation processes where a new bride's worth is literally tested through a series of challenges that can make or break her marriage prospects. The cooking tests are brutal. Mother-in-laws will deliberately provide inadequate ingredients, broken utensils, or impossible time constraints, then judge the bride's ability to produce perfect meals under pressure while maintaining respectful behavior throughout the ordeal. But here's the scary part. Fertility testing involves intimate physical examinations and monitoring of menstrual cycles by elder women who determine whether the bride is capable of producing children quickly enough to justify the lobola investment. New brides live under constant surveillance for their first year of marriage, with every action scrutinized and reported to extended family members who collectively decide whether she's worthy of full family acceptance. The psychological pressure is immense. One poorly cooked meal or perceived sign of disrespect can lead to family rejection and potential divorce, leaving women in constant anxiety about performance rather than focusing on building loving relationships. Sounds unbelievable, but some brides are literally returned to their families like defective merchandise if they fail these tests, with lobola money demands and family shame that can last for decades. Traditional Zimbabwean chiefs maintain the power to banish people from ancestral lands, effectively sentencing them to economic death and social exile that lasts for generations. Banishment isn't just moving to another town, it's complete severance from land rights, ancestral burial grounds, and community support systems that provide survival in rural Zimbabwe. When a traditional chief issues a banishment order, the condemned person loses access to family farmland, water sources, grazing rights for livestock, and participation in community labor exchanges that are essential for agricultural survival. The punishment extends beyond the individual. Their children and grandchildren can inherit banishment status, creating family lines that remain permanently excluded from their ancestral communities. Picture this. Imagine being cut off not just from your hometown, but from your fundamental right to exist in the place where your ancestors are buried and where your cultural identity is rooted. Banished individuals often become urban refugees, forced into poverty in cities where they lack connections, skills, or resources to rebuild their lives. Here's what's truly terrifying. There's no appeal process, no legal representation, and no government authority that can override a traditional chief's banishment decision. Modern human rights organizations estimate that over 50,000 Zimbabweans currently live under various forms of traditional banishment, existing in a legal limbo where they're citizens of Zimbabwe, but forbidden from accessing their ancestral homes and communities. Zimbabwe's Supreme Court legally ruled in 1999 that women cannot be considered equal to men before the law because of African cultural norms, essentially legalizing gender discrimination through judicial precedent. This wasn't some ancient traditional ruling. This was the country's highest modern court system officially declaring that constitutional promises of gender equality don't apply when they conflict with customary cultural practices. The case involved inheritance rights, but the ruling's implications extend far beyond property law, essentially creating legal justification for systematic discrimination in employment, property ownership, and family decision-making. Think progressive legal systems protect women's rights? Think again. Zimbabwe's Supreme Court literally ruled that culture trumps constitutional rights when it comes to gender equality. The decision shocked international human rights organizations because it used legal language to institutionalize discrimination, giving government officials, employers, and family members legal cover to treat women as inferior beings. Here's the most disturbing part. This ruling remains active legal precedent, meaning every court case involving women's rights must consider whether traditional cultural norms justify overriding constitutional protections. Women's rights activists faced an impossible situation, fighting for equality in a legal system that had officially declared equality incompatible with African culture. The psychological impact is devastating. Imagine living in a country where the highest court has legally confirmed that your gender makes you inherently less deserving of equal treatment under law. International legal scholars still study this case as one of the most shocking examples of how modern judicial systems can institutionalize discrimination while maintaining the appearance of legal legitimacy. Number 9. Traditional Zimbabwean rain ceremonies involve entire communities dancing for days without food or water, with participants expected to collapse from exhaustion as proof of their spiritual commitment to ending droughts. These aren't casual cultural festivals. We're talking about grueling spiritual endurance tests, where community survival during droughts depends on demonstrating sufficient suffering and devotion to ancestral spirits. The Mukwerera rain ceremonies require participants to dance continuously from sunrise to sunset for up to 7 consecutive days, wearing heavy traditional costumes in scorching heat while maintaining complex choreographed movements that tell stories of community needs and spiritual supplication. Wait until you find out the physical demands. Dancers are forbidden from eating, drinking water, or resting during daylight hours, with the belief that human sacrifice through voluntary suffering will convince ancestors to release the reins. Community members take turns monitoring dancers to ensure no one cheats by secretly drinking water or eating food, because any spiritual contamination is believed to doom the entire ceremony and prolong the drought. The medical consequences are severe. Dehydration, heat stroke, and physical collapse are not just expected, but viewed as necessary proof that participants are genuinely committed to saving their community from starvation. Here's the mind-blowing part. These ceremonies often work in the sense that rains frequently come during or shortly after the rituals, reinforcing community belief in their effectiveness and ensuring the traditions continue despite their physical dangers. Modern meteorologists attribute the timing to seasonal weather patterns, but for rural Zimbabweans, the correlation between extreme human suffering and subsequent rainfall creates unshakable faith in the spiritual power of collective sacrifice. Number 8. Zimbabwe has traditional marriage practices where grooms must prove their worthiness by completing dangerous tasks, including wrestling wild animals, walking on hot coals, and surviving alone in the wilderness for weeks. These aren't symbolic gestures or tourist performances. We're talking about genuine life or death trials that determine whether a man is considered worthy of marriage and adult status within his community. The Mukanda coming-of-age rituals combined with marriage preparation involve young men demonstrating courage, survival skills, and spiritual fortitude through ordeals that regularly result in serious injuries or death. Grooms must catch and wrestle specific wild animals with minimal tools, proving their ability to protect and provide for a family in environments where wildlife poses constant dangers to livestock and crops. The firewalking ceremonies require men to walk barefoot across beds of burning coals while carrying sacred objects, with any hesitation or visible pain interpreted as spiritual weakness that disqualifies them from marriage. But here's where it gets extreme. Wilderness survival tests involve being left alone in remote areas with no food, water, or tools, expected to survive for 2 to 4 weeks using only traditional knowledge and skills passed down through generations. Failure isn't just embarrassment. Men who cannot complete these trials are considered spiritually immature and may be permanently barred from marrying within their communities. The physical and psychological scars are badges of honor that prove masculine worthiness, but the casualties are real. Families regularly lose young men during these trials, with deaths attributed to spiritual inadequacy rather than dangerous practices. Modern education and urbanization have reduced these practices, but in traditional communities, men still risk everything to prove their worthiness for marriage through trials that would be considered attempted murder in Western societies. Number 7. Zimbabwe operates traditional courts where accused criminals must drink poison to prove their innocence, with death considered evidence of guilt and survival viewed as divine vindication. The Mutapa poison ordeal remains one of Africa's most terrifying examples of trial by ordeal, where suspected criminals face a choice between confession or potentially fatal poison consumption to determine their guilt or innocence. Traditional priests prepare toxic substances from local plants with dosages carefully calculated to be potentially lethal, but allowing for survival if the accused person has sufficient spiritual protection through innocence. Picture this nightmarish scenario. You're accused of theft or adultery, dragged before a traditional court, and forced to choose between admitting guilt or drinking poison that might kill you in front of your entire community. The psychological terror is immense. Innocent people sometimes confess to crimes they didn't commit rather than risk death through poison ordeal, while others drink the poison and suffer severe health consequences even when they survive. Here's the most chilling aspect. Death from poison is interpreted as definitive proof of guilt, meaning families of poison ordeal victims cannot seek justice or compensation because the deceased is considered to have received appropriate punishment for their crimes. Community members genuinely believe the poison only kills guilty people, creating unwavering faith in the system despite obvious medical explanations for the deaths. Modern legal systems technically prohibit these practices, but traditional authorities continue conducting poison ordeals in remote areas where government oversight is minimal and community pressure to maintain ancient justice systems remains overwhelming. International human rights investigators estimate that dozens of Zimbabweans die annually from poison ordeals, but accurate statistics are impossible because families rarely report deaths that occur during traditional legal proceedings. Number 6. Traditional Zimbabwean funeral practices require families to slaughter dozens of cattle and feed thousands of mourners for up to 2 weeks, with costs that routinely exceed $50,000 and force entire extended families into crushing debt that lasts for decades. These aren't simple burial ceremonies. We're talking about massive community festivals that essentially bankrupt families in the name of honoring deceased relatives and maintaining social status within traditional hierarchies. The expectation is that important family members deserve funeral celebrations proportional to their social standing, with cattle slaughter requirements that can reach 50 to 100 animals for respected elders or successful community members. Wait until you find out the logistics. Families must provide accommodation, meals and entertainment for mourners who travel from across the country and expect to be fed 3 meals daily for the entire duration of the funeral period. The cattle alone can cost $30,000 to $40,000, but that's just the beginning. There are professional mourners to hire, traditional musicians, ritual specialists, and elaborate tent structures that transform rural homesteads into temporary cities capable of housing thousands of guests. Here's the devastating part. Families often sell their land, liquidate their children's educational savings, and borrow money at predatory interest rates rather than face the social shame of hosting an inadequate funeral that would be interpreted as evidence of poverty or lack of love for the deceased. The competitive element is ruthless. Families monitor each other's funeral expenditures and judge social standing based on the level of extravagance displayed, creating arms races where each funeral must exceed previous ones in cost and spectacle. Young adults regularly sacrifice their own life opportunities to contribute to funeral expenses, with entire generations trapped in cycles of poverty created by the financial devastation of elaborate death ceremonies that prioritize social appearances over family financial survival. Zimbabwe has traditional spirit medium practices where possessed individuals channel dead ancestors and make binding legal decisions that override government courts, police investigations, and modern medical diagnoses. The Svikiro spirit medium system operates as a parallel authority structure where deceased ancestors supposedly communicate through living mediums to resolve disputes, issue punishments, and provide guidance that communities treat as more authoritative than government institutions. These possession sessions aren't theatrical performances. We're talking about dramatic, altered consciousness states where mediums speak in different voices, demonstrate knowledge they shouldn't possess, and issue complex legal judgments that affect property ownership, criminal justice, and family relationships across entire regions. When a spirit medium declares someone guilty of witchcraft, theft, or adultery while in a possessed state, communities mobilize to enforce the spiritual verdict regardless of contradictory evidence or government legal proceedings. Picture this. A government court acquits someone of murder based on insufficient evidence, but a spirit medium channeling the deceased victim declares the accused person guilty and demands compensation. The community will often ignore the official verdict and enforce the spiritual judgment instead. The psychological power is immense. People confess to crimes during spirit medium sessions that they never admitted during police interrogations, believing that lying to ancestral spirits will result in supernatural punishment, far worse than legal consequences. Here's what's truly mind-blowing. Spirit mediums regularly provide information about missing persons, stolen property, and unsolved crimes that proves accurate when investigated, creating unshakable community faith in their supernatural abilities. Modern psychologists attribute this to the medium's deep knowledge of community dynamics and careful observation of social tensions, but for rural Zimbabweans, the accuracy of spirit medium revelations confirms the reality of ancestral communication. Government officials often find themselves powerless to enforce legal decisions that contradict spirit medium pronouncements, creating a shadow legal system where dead ancestors wield more authority than living judges. Zimbabwe has traditional cleansing rituals for widows that involve forced sexual intercourse with designated male relatives or hired strangers, supposedly to remove spiritual contamination that threatens entire communities. This practice, known as kurova guva, represents one of Africa's most disturbing examples of how traditional beliefs can institutionalize sexual violence against vulnerable women under the guise of spiritual protection. Widows are considered spiritually dangerous after their husband's death, carrying contamination that can supposedly cause crop failures, livestock deaths, and community disasters if not properly cleansed through ritualistic sexual encounters. The psychological coercion is systematic. Widows are told that refusing cleansing rituals will result in supernatural punishment, permanent social ostracism, and denial of access to their deceased husband's property or their own children. Community pressure is overwhelming. Family members, religious leaders, and neighbors all participate in convincing widows that they have no choice but to submit to these rituals for the greater good of community spiritual health. Here's the most horrifying aspect. The men chosen for cleansing rituals are often strangers specifically hired for the purpose, creating a system where grieving women are essentially forced into prostitution disguised as spiritual necessity. The practice has contributed significantly to HIV transmission rates, as cleansing rituals typically involve unprotected sex with multiple partners over extended periods, turning spiritual cleansing into potential death sentences for already traumatized widows. Modern women's rights organizations have launched intensive campaigns to eliminate these practices, but traditional authorities continue defending them as essential cultural requirements that prevent supernatural disasters. The legal system remains largely powerless because these rituals typically occur in private family settings where government oversight is minimal and community solidarity protects perpetrators from prosecution. International human rights investigators estimate that thousands of Zimbabwean widows continue to face forced sexual cleansing annually, but accurate statistics remain impossible due to the secretive nature of these traditional practices. Traditional Zimbabwean chiefs maintain private armies of young men who enforce their decisions through violence, intimidation, and extrajudicial punishments that include public beatings, property destruction, and forced labor sentences. These aren't ceremonial guards or symbolic warriors. We're talking about organized paramilitary groups that traditional authorities use to maintain control over rural populations through systematic intimidation and violence that operates completely outside government oversight. The young men, known as war veterans or traditional warriors, receive weapons, training, and explicit permission to use violence against anyone who challenges traditional authority or refuses to comply with customary law decisions. When traditional chiefs issue punishments for adultery, theft, or disrespecting elders, these private armies carry out sentences that can include public floggings, destruction of homes and crops, and forced labor that amounts to temporary slavery. Picture this terrifying scenario. You disagree with a traditional chief's decision about land use or family inheritance, and within hours, armed young men surround your home, destroy your property, and force you to work unpaid in the chief's fields until you submit to his authority. The psychological impact extends beyond individual victims. Entire communities live in fear of challenging traditional authority because they know violent enforcement is immediate and brutal, while government police are often hours or days away and reluctant to interfere in traditional justice systems. Here's what makes this system particularly insidious. These traditional armies operate with impunity because they claim to be enforcing customary law, which has legal recognition alongside modern law, creating a gray area where violence against civilians is justified as legitimate traditional authority. Government officials often collaborate with traditional chiefs rather than confronting them because rural electoral support depends on maintaining good relationships with traditional authorities who control large voting populations. International human rights organizations have documented systematic patterns of violence by traditional enforcement groups, but prosecution remains virtually impossible because victims are afraid to testify and communities protect traditional authorities from outside interference. The result is a parallel justice system where traditional chiefs wield more practical power than elected officials and can literally terrorize their subjects into compliance through organized violence. Zimbabwe has traditional marriage practices where men can legally claim unlimited wives through customary law, while women face criminal prosecution for adultery, creating a legal system where gender-based double standards are constitutionally protected. This isn't historical discrimination. We're talking about active legal frameworks where polygamy remains completely legal for men under customary law, while women can be imprisoned for having multiple sexual partners or divorcing without male permission. The legal contradiction is staggering. The same constitution that theoretically guarantees gender equality also explicitly protects traditional practices that treat women as male property with no independent sexual or romantic autonomy. Men can legally maintain households with multiple wives, father children with numerous women, and abandon families without legal consequences, while women who attempt similar behavior face criminal charges, community ostracism, and loss of property rights. Here's where the system becomes truly twisted. Women in polygamous marriages have no legal recourse for domestic violence, financial abandonment, or sexual coercion because traditional law treats these as internal family matters beyond government jurisdiction. The economic exploitation is systematic. Men use polygamy to acquire unpaid agricultural labor from multiple wives, while denying them property ownership or inheritance rights that would provide economic independence. Criminal courts regularly prosecute women for adultery, while simultaneously recognizing men's customary right to multiple sexual partners, creating a legal system where identical sexual behavior results in drastically different legal consequences based solely on gender. Modern legal scholars describe Zimbabwe's marriage law as one of the world's most blatant examples of constitutionally protected gender discrimination, where traditional cultural practices explicitly override individual rights guarantees. The psychological impact on women is devastating. Imagine living in a society where your gender automatically makes you subject to different legal standards, where men's sexual freedom is legally protected while identical behavior by women results in criminal punishment. International pressure for legal reform continues, but traditional authorities and many government officials defend polygamy and adultery prosecutions as essential elements of African cultural identity that must be preserved regardless of human rights concerns. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation crisis created a surreal economy where people needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread, but now those worthless trillion-dollar bills sell for hundreds of dollars to collectors, making Zimbabwe's currency failure one of the most valuable economic disasters in human history. This represents the ultimate economic paradox, a complete monetary collapse so spectacular that it created a new form of valuable commodity from worthless money, with former Zimbabwean currency now worth more as collectible curiosities than it ever was during circulation. At the peak of hyperinflation in 2008, prices were doubling every single day, creating a nightmarish economic reality where money became worthless faster than people could spend it, and citizens literally needed suitcases full of trillion-dollar bills to purchase basic groceries. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe was printing denominations that reached $100 trillion. That's 100 trillion on a single banknote. And these astronomical amounts couldn't buy a loaf of bread or a bus ticket because inflation was accelerating faster than new currency could be printed and distributed. Picture the absolute insanity. Families would wake up each morning to discover that their life savings from the previous day were now insufficient to buy a single meal, while grocery store prices changed multiple times per hour as merchants desperately tried to keep pace with the collapsing currency value. The social chaos was complete. Employers stopped paying wages in Zimbabwean dollars because the money became worthless before workers could spend it, leading to a barter economy where goods and services were exchanged directly without monetary transactions. Here's the mind-blowing twist that makes this the ultimate economic irony. Those trillion-dollar bills that couldn't buy anything in Zimbabwe now sell for $200 to $600 each to international collectors and economic museums, making the currency worth exponentially more as historical artifacts than it ever was as actual money. Currency dealers worldwide stock Zimbabwean hyperinflation notes as premium collectibles, and complete sets of trillion-dollar denominations can command thousands of dollars from economists, history buffs, and investors who view them as tangible proof of monetary policy gone catastrophically wrong. The psychological impact created a generation of Zimbabweans who fundamentally distrust paper currency and honestly prefer bartering gold or foreign currencies for transactions. This effectively created a post-monetary society where people survived one of history's most extreme economic collapses by completely abandoning faith in government-issued money. So, we've just discovered Zimbabwe's most shocking cultural and economic secrets. From trillion-dollar bills that couldn't buy bread to traditional courts that override modern law, and from marriage trials involving wild animals to poison ordeals that, shockingly, kill the innocent. Which one shocked you the most? Have you ever experienced hyperinflation or traditional justice systems? Drop your thoughts below and hey, subscribe for more mind-blowing revelations that'll change how you see the world.